Very happy to be here. I've given some lectures elsewhere, but to be here in Africa in another situation, it's like home away from home. And I want to tell you more about how the journey of my life as a professional architect has been, because we are architects and we are talking about architecture. But just to say that for me, architecture has this tremendous power to transform situations. And Leslie mentioned some, our situation in Ethiopia, in Africa, as you mostly know, is not part of what is the norm. We are working in very extraordinary circumstances. But for me, I have to say that to be able to do this in my country, in my home place, where it matters, is one of the best gifts that I could have. So, talking about what it means for me, the power of architecture to transform. Maybe a little bit about, I wanted to talk about Ethiopia, what my country means to me, and why I'm so passionate to do what I'm doing through the tools of and the power of architecture. So Ethiopia is located in the east of Africa. It's an East African country, very much an amazing place. I grew up there, I lived there all my life. So the history of our country, it being never colonized in the 1880s, the Italians were chased out by our forefathers, gave the Ethiopian people a sense of pride, a very passionate pride and identity in place that resonates throughout generations. And it does that for all of us. We're very proud people. We're very, through thick and thin, through famines and wars and all sorts of in and out, that fact, that pride of identity remains. It is a big country, 100 million people now. It's the second largest populated country in Africa. But just talking about the different ethnic groups, cultures, we have Muslims, Orthodox Christian, Catholic. It's a place where everything comes together to form a beautiful place. But right now I just want to talk about the architecture and how, for us, the identity of being Ethiopians spans generations back. We have the Aksum Empire, which is on the far left. As you see, it's from 100 AD on, and so we have this beautiful stele and the city where the Aksumite Empire, where the Abyssinian Empire started to build, and that is a beautiful, beautiful heritage. Even now, it's one of the World Heritage places. And so, they built this amazing steles and underground palaces. And then you see on the left the Lalibela Churches, which later on in the 12th century, King Lalibela built his city in the north of Ethiopia. And those are, if you know, some of you know about this, many, many churches underground, which have been constructed underground. And they are very much part of our history and our architectural identity. And then there's the Fasil churches, Gondar castles, again, this is in the 16th century. So what I'm saying is, and then the vernacular architecture that is abundant. So we have this history of heritage of architectural transitions that we kind of refer to, because those civilizations have done great work. So moving on to Addis Ababa, which is the capital city of Ethiopia, just want to say how I grew up here in Addis. And it is, again, because Ethiopia was not colonized, it became, Addis Ababa was the center of and the capital of Africa. That's how it's called, because the UNECA, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, was started there. The African Union, which used to be the headquarters, OAU at that time, was there. And most diplomatic missions during the Emperor Menelik's time when Addis Ababa was started in 1886. So most of the emperor brought in all this diplomats. So it is also a place for most Ethiopians, different ethnic groups, different cultures, different religions, different places to come into the center of Addis, but also it is the diplomatic capital of Africa. So it is quite an important place, and even in the 50s, in the 60s, after the short colonial occupation of Italy in 1936 to 41, then Ethiopia continued in its modern transformation of the cities through Menelik and then Haile Selassie, Emperor Haile Selassie. And so you see that it is a place where culture, religion, spaces, public spaces were already important in the 50s and the 60s. And it was kind of a melting pot of everyone coming together there. So you see some of our landmarks in the city, modern buildings, churches, the city hall, which is one of the most important buildings. So we grew up, as Ethiopians, being part of this culture and identity. This is in the 1970s and 80s. I lived most of my life at the top of that hill. It's called Arada or Piazza neighborhood. It's one of the oldest neighborhoods of Addis Ababa. Very quaint, very, the architecture is kind of mixed, but also I'll show you a slide later on how that kind of influenced my thinking later on. But just the fact that Addis Ababa as a city, the freedom of the people for us growing up was a melting pot of ideas of modern with vernacular, with and mixed. It's an organic formation of how the city grew. This is the UNECA. Sorry, it's not a but one of the very most important buildings in Addis, not only because of the style, which is a modern style, but mostly because of what it represented to Ethiopia. So this is Piazza. I was talking about this neighborhood where I grew up. I loved that Piazza and this Arada neighborhood. It brought everybody together. It was merchants and it was a shopping, it's the older shopping and market area. And the architecture, as you see, is a mix of many, many, many cultures and international people. So the Greeks were there, the Armenians were there, the Italians during their 6-year occupation were there, the Ethiopians and the kings we brought in from all the other parts of Ethiopia, the mud and tukul structures that were changed into square forms. And that is kind of a transformation and a transition of the Ethiopian mix of what the city is. But most importantly for me growing up, apart from the architecture, which was accepting of everyone, and literally everyone, because at the back of the streets are very, very, very low-income houses, but everyone lived together in peace, in harmony. Everybody worked, had the same kind of appropriation to the spaces. So we grew up very much thinking that space is about people, and it's people who make the space. So there is that interrelation of what buildings and spaces and architecture does. So this is Addis Ababa. I mean, in the last 20, 30 years, it completely transformed, opened up to, in the 1990s, after the communist time of 17 years and the famine that you've known and all the problems, then in 91, 92, a new regime came about to, very much transformative and very much trying to work on poverty and poverty reduction. So opening up to globalization, to industrialization, means that we have all the investors coming in. So I graduated actually exactly at that time in 91, which kind of came together in a sense that it was a fresh start. Country was going into a new space of political, social changes. Therefore, as young architects, we were basically at the forefront of that change. This is the new African Union headquarters, again amplifying the fact that Ethiopia was more and more invested in all this internationalness and coming together of the city for the common purpose of all. So not only the African Union, but we have 114 embassies. You will see in my work, that's why I'm talking about the embassies and the international institutions and the importance of Addis as a city, because basically there is about 114 embassies and delegations, the third largest diplomatic presence after New York and Belgium. And so that is quite an important thing when you talk about a city, a country that is very much in the international scene. And then, of course, in the last 20 years, urbanization and fast economic growth. Ethiopia is has shown one of the largest growth economically. But what does that mean for architecture, the built environment, for us working as architects in the city? It's both big opportunity, like I said, but also a challenge in the sense that as we are coming out of a very closed system from communism and coming out into this open market, then that is how open market brings in all new ideas very fast. Nobody is waiting for designs or urban planning or all these things. And so fast construction is happening. And so you see the city changing constantly. This is in the last 15 years, basically completely changed, new railway systems, new projects, new buildings. And so also in the peripheries, we have about, the idea about 300, 400,000 social housing units to be built. So the city has been transforming so much, but then again, like all other cities in most parts of the world, the inequalities and the urban poverty, are in sync with growth. And the inner cities are relocated to the outer peripheries. And there is a lot of social problems around that, and also around unemployment and youth underemployment and all these challenges that growth and fast urbanization. When I say, to me, I said I graduated in 91, so basically in the last 27 years, it was like a driving force of construction and design and construction. There was no breathing space. So you had to engage in either all these projects that are coming up, mostly copied, very poor copies of the Dubai style or the Chinese style or whatever it is, and with very low quality, or you as a professional can make a choice of what is it that I want to do. Because for me, growing up, I knew that as an Ethiopian, I have seen the good, the bad, the modern, the old, the poor, the rich. So how do we engage and transform? And if we say that architecture has the power to transform, how do we actually engage? So for me, there's three ways that I felt, summing up my journey now and looking back at what was important to me. It was very much the human-centered approach to architecture, whatever the project was. And I have done work that are very, very, very small, maybe working and, for small mud projects for someone's house to large embassy projects. But whatever it is, that humanness, that connection is very vital, especially in the context of Africa, in the context of Ethiopia, in the context where we know that little intervention in the color you use can make a huge transformation and difference to people. So let me just say the power of architecture to make a difference. I was very fortunate. I graduated, I got into this project. It is a kind of Addis Ababa style architecture, as you see. Could look very simple, but for me and a team of young architects, we worked 2 years on this project. We had to do working drawings and aid our architects, our senior architect. But for me, the most important part of that was we were in a little container working there young, but the whole issue for me was how we do design, how you do design. Each and every little intervention in that design process, you actually carry right there on the site. Because it was a church project, basically it meant that we didn't have an actual contractor, but we had to train mostly street kids to build this amazing project and bring it to the excellence that it required. So for me, it was that complete continuation of my life growing up, that through my work or through our work as architects, we design, we build, but then literally it means that unless you're there on the ground and working to transform people and mentalities and mindsets, then this project will not be done. So it was a very interesting way for us to start 2 years later our own practice. And I have to say that there are some projects that are, most projects as an architect, everybody asks me, which projects do you like? And for me, it's all different in different ways because of how you engage through the different means. This project for me was one of the first projects that I worked on that made a big difference in my life. It was a hospital for women, and imagine I was very young at that time, and it's called Fistula Hospital. I don't know if some of you know. It's for young girls, mostly from the countryside. They get married very, very young, and during childbirth, fistula happens, so there's no control of the urine and the leakage. So we get involved in this project very young. I go there, and we see this amazing doctors and nurses in this beautiful hilly part of Addis. But really, there was nothing there. It was, a group of mud houses. And so we had to kind of slowly do interventions. So I remember walking in every time onto the site, designing one little building, because that's what the cost was. Maybe this time it was renovating the ward. Next time it was extending the operation theater. And then next time it was just building tukuls around the huge site. But for me, it is a very humble architecture, as you will see now. The interventions are very, very, very simple. But the end result is like you walk into the site, you walk into the buildings, and you see all these women that are actually very happily using the little space that you created. So this was a project that we did over 10 years because it was, you get one project and then you're called next year because now we have funding for the next one. So it was, unless as an architect, you kind of have a sense of involvement and a passion, and that at the end of all these projects, you will make a difference, then you cannot take it as a professional working. Then this is a project, I get paid, and I run. So that is what I meant, because it is very transformative, and it is helping others reach be happy. But the whole concept of the architecture was, like I said, for these young women not to feel overwhelmed in a huge space, because as architects we have that tendency to run off and do amazing, new, beautiful, aesthetically pleasing structure, but the intervention for us was how to bring light into the spaces, how, when they go out, they have the verandas and the nature and all these things that will bring healing to them. This is another hospital. Again, we're not only doing hospitals, but just so I can give you an idea of what it means, that power to transform spaces is up to us as architects. This is Cure Hospital, is for young children. So this was an already existing hospital, but we were asked to intervene to bring more light, and just that the understanding that with your touch, with what you create, you're actually imagining each and every one of these kids having that space to explore, to have healing. But the next phase was a healing and rehabilitation center, which was on a hill. And the idea was, okay, we don't have money, and you don't become a client with an architect with a TOR, but you help build a TOR. And because architects have knowledge, so we said, okay, this is a hilly side. We know you have only, budget for 1 floor and 20 buildings, but we really should design you an incremental kind of space, because you're going to end up using the spaces. So I mean, after all the discussions and all, we came up with this very simple idea that eventually when they get money, they can do the incremental kind of, and they're already now doing it, which is nice. But also, it's not only, of course, hospitals. And how does architecture transform any project? How do we as architects go into, this is a hotel, a resort project in the south of Ethiopia, where the client obviously desired a concrete building looking out into the lake. And we deferred and said, no, let us work on how we see the identity of that place, how we can use the materials that are beautiful, how we can use the interiors. But they said, but tukuls are dark spaces. No, we can light them up. We can make them very interesting. We can give you your ideas, but in a very local intervention. So we're building about right now 18 and 20 of these small tukuls, and eventually the client gets caught up in this, and because it's an amazing space and one of the most beautiful places for wildlife and bird life, actually. So we're kind of slowly maneuvering and building spaces and interventions. And some people say, yes, I'm very much a contemporary ideas, but how can we mesh contemporary design and local design? How can we do that? So we come up with plenty of ideas. This is a building in Lalibela, and we're having the ideas to use the rocks to construct this. But the reality is you don't get to have all these projects all over Ethiopia in amazing places. Or the reality is we have urban projects that require attention, that require our connection to our identity and our background. So, for example, this building is a SOS Kinderdorf. It is an apartment building. It's right smack in Bole, which is full of these glass towers. And and we are like, okay, we're going to use the Addis Ababa style concept of a very simple 2 towers that are connected into blocks. And people like it because it is very simple building. That's not the whole point is that people refer to it as wow, we like that building because it reminds us of it is something ours, even though it's in a modern way. But interventions also happen in very modern ways in an international setting, like, for example, this project in Addis. Again, it's the embassy, Ireland embassy. And I remember when we were given this project, usually because embassies are done by their own architects, and then you collaborate as a local architect. But you have built up slowly through the years that trust with clients, that sense of excellence that you can provide, whether it's a small building in the countryside or whether it is a building in the city. So this was a project very much has a budget issue, very small budget. And so we did that in 1 year with no variation basically, but most of the materials that you see is locally fabricated, including all the sound insulations, because we pushed for design ideas that would make sense and that we would show even to the international community that we can do it locally. We don't have to import too many things. We can use our beautiful stonework. We have a lot of people who work on, tradesmen who work on stone, because stone is part of our culture. Going on, what I believe the power of architecture has done for me is it continued inspiring, because it is a very difficult profession to be working in the context that we were working in. But these collaborative practices and participatory and that inclusive practice was really an exciting part of my office and what I do, because it brings new ideas to the fore. It brings not only international ideas, but we give so much to those projects. And then these projects become known both as landmarks in Ethiopia, but also internationally. I mean, you've seen, I'm sure you're very well aware of the Netherlands Embassy. That was one project that, as a bigger intervention we got early on. And at first, we're like, okay, this is designed, it looked amazing on paper. And the architects or Dutch architects came in looking for young architects to collaborate. And it was such a complex building, thinking about how we're gonna manage this, how we're gonna manage the engineering of it, because it's actually 140 meters by 14 meters concrete building that when you finish it, it's finished. So there's no plastering or there's nothing. So you and myself as the coordinator of this project had to make sure that each and every little socket, including, I don't know, drainage and everything was coordinated and part of the engineering idea as well. Of course, this the idea is the Lalibela Churches. It is sometimes going into the landscape as you see. And then it is a huge land. This is one building, but we had like 5, 6 other buildings in the landscape to take care of. This became a very, very important project for me and for our team as a learning curve. But also it became very successful. It won the Aga Khan Award because of that sense of togetherness we had with the architects. We were about 20 or 25 in the team, including the of Arab and all this international and local architects and engineers. So you can imagine how for 2 years we worked on this project. I was actually basically rooted on the site most of the time because it's hard for interpretation of this project to the excellence and level of detailing that was required. But why is it's successful, and why this architecture, I feel, has the power to transform us and our knowledge is both ways. Sometimes you see here, I mean, this is the roofscape, and we had to carve each one like an art piece. But the whole idea is that team spirit, that work, that when architects come out from outside, they're very much surprised to find people who can do this thing, who have the knowledge, who have the idea to discuss and to take over this project and have it done on the ground. I think that is because architecture is not about designing, because if it was only about designing, this would have been a dream probably, but it is about actually making it happen on the site. And the next project that has kind of the same importance is the British Council. Very small project compared to, I mean, in area and size, but very important because of all the sustainability ideas in it. This was, again, the idea of reusing the beautiful, it was kind of not a forest, but we had a lot of trees. We had to cut them down, preserve them, sow them, and preserve them for a year before we used it as a cladding on the concrete facade. But for me, this is another, because embassies and institutions like this is actually placed inside the British Embassy compound. They come with this high specification. I remember sometimes, people would come and say, okay, we're going to make sure that we're going to light a torch on the wall and see that it doesn't have a bump on the plaster. You're like, I know who I'm dealing with here, So how do you bring your projects up to that standard? It is by just, constantly being there, constantly detailing and more detailing and more detailing. Sometimes we have to show the contractors or the builders on site in a one-to-one sometimes for them to understand, to get it. So again, this was for me a project that keeps on, building up the bar of excellence, because these projects in their simplicity or in their complexedness gives us in our offices and our practice the same growth and standardization that we don't have in Ethiopia. So that is what we gain, but what we give is that whoever comes there in the local context, whoever flies in, yes, we can deliver good projects. Again, this is showing, this section is very interesting because it shows all the natural ways that we ventilated it. We used sun pipes because this is a very, it's about security, and all the, the walls, most of the walls were concrete. So we used sun pipes from the top of the ceiling to light up the spaces, and wind catchers to ventilate the spaces. And then we had water, we saved the water, and then the trees. And so this is kind of an experimental kind of project that did very nicely. The other projects that maybe most of you are aware of, I'm showing this because this is, I'm very proud that I worked on this project with Mpeti from RA Architects. And I remember him coming and I was just starting my practice. I had nothing. I had one table and a chair, actually. And they walked in, 14 of them, tall, big men. And they said, we want you to do this project. And I'm like, I don't have space. I just split from my previous partner. But that trust was there on the ability because of what you've done before. And so it was one of the most amazing collaborations because this is Africa to Africa. It was very important for both of us. And we invested a lot of energy because these buildings, all of these embassy buildings, have to have that sense of architecturally South African, for example, in this case, and Ethiopian. So how do you do that? Is it through materials? Is it through concepts? So it has a lot of connection. And if the architects or whoever is leading the project are not in sync, I feel it would not have happened. So I hope the South African architects, engineers, the team had as much joy in working on this project that my team had, contractors, everyone. So again, we've used Ethiopian materials. Most of the granites that you see are from Ethiopia, and then some we've flown from South Africa. And for me, it was a knowledge base, and the screen, the beautiful screen from an artist in South Africa. So you can imagine the travels, the details, in a place where there's no networks, there's no power, so you imagine that you're working in a very difficult context as well, and managing all these projects at the same time. Another project that it's not an embassy, but again, how the standards and the need of our clients are increasing. This is a school project, but in the school project, they wanted as much intervention and and ideas and beautiful Ethiopian stonework that we brought in from the north of Ethiopia, because we're like, okay, now we've seen in most of my projects, I use stone in different design patterns. Why don't we bring a Tsela stone from the north of Ethiopia? It's one of the most beautiful stones. And so we brought them in. And you know that in every project we experiment on a green wall system, we experiment on different ways of interventions, but always on my idea on the power of that project to transform. Because on each and every project, what I've seen is when you push for excellence, when you push for that sense of design thinking in little interventions, you know, everybody gets excited. But you have to push, you have to pull all the time. But at the end of the day, everybody is proud, including contractors, clients. And for me, each and every project, as I said, whether it's the small one or the big ones, the most important ones, always have some kind of impact on people. And in this case, the embassy projects. Of course, people are enjoying the spaces, but we're using all of these projects, and international projects especially, for a learning curve as well, because we take university students to them, they walk through them, and it becomes an interactive space as well, because we're saying that unless students see this, how we did all these interventions, then it's not, we cannot just teach them in school. They don't get it. For me, the most important thing, apart from the designs, is if we think about it only as, okay, architecture is designing and building. But through that design-build process, how many people are we involving? You can imagine from your office to the site, to the clients, to the society, to the landmarks when people pass through them, everybody gets a sense of ownership of that project. It's not only about, especially, as I said, in the context of our cities and our places, where it just stands out. It's not about it being an 8-story building. It's about the quality and that sense of design thinking and sensitivity you give into the project. But for me, I think unless, as I said, we have so many students that are coming from our universities, there's so much unemployment, underemployment, there's so much need, because our universities, they bring in architects from schools, and you actually have to train on the spot, on the site, and basically you cannot talk about it. What I'm saying is, my take on it is, you have to be there on the site, whether it is in the north of Ethiopia, where people will look at you, of course, as, why is this woman? I mean, I have not talked about the gender part, but it doesn't matter. I mean, any architect, when we see that gap, unless we have, unless we transfer that design, those ideas into the actual hands and tell them through our presence how to do it, then it's not going to happen. At least that's what I saw in our context. So this is our office in Addis Ababa, and the office is not a typical office, especially eventually as we saw and as we grew, because I realized early on that you will have so many architects coming in, young architects, but then, okay, now it has to be a school. In fact, it has to be a training ground as well, because they don't come in with that knowledge or that tools. They don't have the tools to actually work in the space. So it's always been a learning ground. And we take on projects like this, for example. This is a public project. I mean, it is in a neighborhood where we took in 70,000 square meters of leftover space that is people are dumping garbage on them, and we're saying, let's appropriate them, let's take them, let's have a community projects, because that is how you give a chance for more people or more young architects to come, and on the side of the business, you can work on it. These are some of the female architects who are working for me for a long time, some of them young, but that driving force, that you have to have that energy to drive design, even if it's not given to you by a client. Again, as I've said, I am very much into educating young people, because I see that need constantly. I'm not teaching at the universities full time, but what I do is I use my office as a space for learning. They come, and I am as an external advisor, and I'm constantly working with young people. Mostly internships. We have a space for interns, not a big space, but it's a library. They come in, and they're always working and walking in, walking out. I don't even know at this time, especially women who are mostly not into, we're seeing so much of them into the field. So that is the social responsibility that I feel I have to have as an architect, because again, we're using the tool of architecture, because architecture gives us that space to transform and to build and to design amazing aesthetics or functional building, but also it gives us a space through design to have that discussion and that openness for transforming people and impacting people. Again, as Leslie said on my bio, apart from that, it is becoming a space. Now it's too small for us, but where we gather, even these are older architects or engineers or civil, and we gather to just see how we can mentor, how can we support young female architects as well. And I'm driving that, and this has become also my passion on the side, that we, as Ethiopian women, have such an important role in our society. And we're doing amazing work if we were given the chance and the opportunity. And mostly it is about skills. It's soft skills. It's trying to break that norm of the man being in charge of architecture and the building construction and all that. So it is a huge exercise. I go to schools of architecture all around Ethiopia, and I give lectures, special lectures to students, but mostly on the side. These girls, young girls, need that kind of assurance. And that can only happen because you are there physically. And that means a lot to them, and it means a lot to me. They inspire me more than I inspire them. And so, yes, I think that architecture has the powerful tool of transforming. We can design, we're continuing designing amazing buildings, but also we have to be part of transforming people and impacting people. Thank you very much.